Tua Tagovailoa is the latest NFL player to suffer an unfortunate concussion, which we know is extremely serious and taken very seriously by the NFL teams, their training staffs, and the league office itself. What we want to try to find out is, what goes into that process? What goes into a player's return or his keep away from the NFL field after suffering a concussion? Tua is not the first player where there's some controversy surrounding that situation for him, but he is the latest. And so I thought this was a great opportunity to bring to you guys a professional who's been around this protocol, been a part of administering this protocol, to explain to us specifically what goes into it and really who makes those types of decisions. So with me to do that is former NFL physical therapist and athletic trainer for both the Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles, Aaron Borgmann. Aaron, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is very important, I think, for our audience and our fans to really get a true understanding of what goes into those decisions. As you saw with this latest situation surrounding Tua, there's been an incredible amount of hot takes and spicy takes and all these different things where we're seeing blame thrown from this person to this person and this person. But what I haven't seen, Aaron, where I think there's so much value from you, is what I haven't seen is that information, that education as to actually what that process is. So the first thing I'd love to just get a sense for is you see a player go down and there's some level of observable sign that, hey, we got to give this guy a look. Right from there, tell us what goes into that.
Yeah, so kind of like you and I were talking, let's make some disclosures here. Like, right, we weren't there. We don't know exactly what happened, but let's talk in generalities about this situation, right? As a person who's been working on the sideline previously, you assume head injury or concussion when someone goes down until you're proven otherwise, right? And so what that means is if the person's laying on the ground, if the person's stumbling, if the person's whatever, you always assume the worst, at least I did, and you work backward from that. And so what you do is you take what you see, right, combined with, and this could be any player. Let's take the player in question out of it for right now. You take what you see combined with what they're telling you, what they're feeling, any observable signs and symptoms, any very outward appearances, and you start to formulate, an initial diagnosis. Now, that happens both on the sideline, first and foremost, right? And what happens then on the sideline then dictates what happens next, whether that player has told you something regarding neurologic signs and symptoms, has told you something regarding their consciousness, how they're feeling, this and that. And then you take that information and then you decide from here, is something more thorough, warranted inside the locker room, or in concert with the player and the team's medical staff and the independent neurologist. There's a three-prong attack there, whether or not that player is warranted to return to the game from that point. And so really, I think what a lot of people misunderstand is it's not the player just saying he's okay. That's not good enough.
That's what I was going to ask you there, because that's an interesting thing that I think a lot of people want to find out, right? Not just in this particular situation, but in all these situations. How much we know that players, right, are hardwired to want to be on the field.
Every player wants to go back. Every one of them, right? And so it's not just their desire to return to the game. Okay. We've decided years ago that was no longer good enough. And, I don't want to say players lie. That's not true. But they're competitive, right? And they want to compete, especially at the NFL level. And so if you rely solely on a player's desire to return to the game, as a healthcare practitioner, you're probably doing that player injustice. And sometimes you have to be the best advocate for that person, because right, wrong, or otherwise, there's players out there that will not be their best advocate because they want to compete. And, we see that, right? And so anymore, it's not just, hey, I can go. Well, okay, that's great, but let's decide if that's actually true, kind of thing, right? And so between the player, between the medical staff, between, the independent medical staff that's now on every sideline and in the spotter's booth and things like that, then I'm making up a word here, but a culminative decision is being made, right? And it's no longer yes or no, I can go. It's not the old how many fingers am I holding up on the sideline? Do you see stars? Do you not know that? That's way gone by the wayside. And as NFL personnel now, they have so many checks and balances to decide, the correct decision for the player. And I think that's really important and that's really advantageous because now, and you like to hope in most cases that those checks and balances provide you a situation to where it's the best decision for the player. I was actually a part of a situation in Philadelphia where before this current system was put in place, that wasn't the case. And, we caught heat for it and probably likely should have, but it made the overall product in the NFL better. And so, through problems, there's a lot of times growth, right? And so you see the fact that the concussion protocol now is probably the most stringent in all of sports. Outwardly, people obviously have their opinions and their hot takes and things like that. But having been a part of it for so many years and being a part of the generation where this new STEPS program was put into place, I think it's really advantageous for the players.
I do think that's a really interesting point from the standpoint of you were part of the transition from the old way to what we really see today in the times. And I want to take you back because you mentioned the idea of checks and balances. You mentioned the idea of an independent neurologist. A lot of the questions I think fans have is the head coach responsible for ultimately who gets back on the field and who doesn't in those situations?
It's a great question because a lot of people think that the coaching staff has something to do with this. And really, honestly, not much, right? I was very fortunate to work with a coach that deferred to us a lot on all medical decisions. Now, obviously, they have their opinions about what should happen and what should not. But a good head coach is not going to pressure a medical staff one way or the other. Yes, they want all their players back, right? Every coach does. But, a good head coach also cares about their players too. And so really, if the system is set up correctly, and I can only speak to one head coach and one medical staff, but if the system is set up correctly, then the head coach will take the information that the head medical staff is giving them, right? And then use that yes or no, what do we have, what do we not? And the head coach in this particular situation is involved very little and sometimes not even existently because it's really not even his call as to whether or not the player returns because that has to be decided by, 3 or 4 people ahead of him, right? And then he just takes the information as it goes. And so I think what's really valuable to your point has been that transition to add in all these checks and balances because that's really what the player safety initiative has been about, right? And everybody can go check these out on the NFLPA and the NFL's website, the concussion protocol. And what I think is the most important thing in general, as a rule, is the addition of these unaffiliated neuro consults is that these people truly are, independent. They don't get paid by the team. They're not, they live in these towns because that logistically, that's what you have to do. But they're there to add another layer of safety for the player. So it's not just the team doc saying that they can go back. It's not just the head athletic trainer saying they can go back. Well, there's another layer there now. And I think that's only, helpful for the player, right?
Yeah. And I think, to that end, that's the confusion I think a lot of fans have is we're so used to thinking the head coach is the head coach. He makes the calls. He makes all the shots. He has full control. But this new process has really taken a lot of that control away from the coaching staffs to really benefit the player.
Right. And I think that's a lot less pressure for the player as well, too, if you think about it, right? Like he doesn't have to impress the head coach. He doesn't have to convince the head coach. Everybody knows that the players and the coaches, they want the players to be on the field. That's not in question, right? But now with this added layer of security and, like I said, checks and balances for the player, I think that takes that away and that makes the head coach's decision even easier. Now, personally, I'm selfish here. I used to be part of a medical staff, right? I would like to see the head coach in general across the league speak on these issues less and less because they don't have these facts. It's not their job, right? They don't have the ability to talk about these medical conditions the way some do. And we've seen some very forward-thinking head coaches put the medical staffs in front of the cameras to dictate how all these things happen. I'd like to see that more because I don't think it's the head coach's responsibility to do that. But, some things take time, right? I think we're doing better with that, and some head coaches are relinquishing control less and less, and being like, okay, look, let's step aside. Let's have people who are educated on these topics talk in front of the media, so then that information can be disseminated correctly, as opposed to, I don't know, I'll have to talk to the doctors. Like, I don't know, is that really good enough anymore? I'm not sure.
And that's been I think the biggest issue, not just in this most recent situation, but the situations that have come prior, is you have these guys come to the microphone and they ultimately start to pass the buck onto the medical staff anyway, who then the fans ultimately never hear from. And so it just, what that leaves is this void, where, as you and I both well know, when there's a void of information, there's a number of people who will take advantage of trying to fill that void with nonsense. So I want to just continue this for a second, because you've been very gracious with your time, and I appreciate that. You and I both know, I at a much different level than you, clearly, but we've both worked with NFL players. We've both worked with NFL coaching staffs. Not all injuries are equal. They're not all the same, right? You also know that I work with individuals with special needs. I say this about autism all the time. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. If you've met one person with a concussion, you've met one person with a concussion. Take us through the process after the game is over. What does that look like for a player to now return to practice and the games following?
Yeah, so it's pretty close to the saying, if you've dealt with one concussion, you've dealt with one concussion, right? I'm going to give credit to my old boss for kind of instilling that in me. And I think what's really important with that is that concussions vary wildly, right? We used to grade them, and that was pretty poor on our part as healthcare practitioners, but we've learned from that, right? And so we no longer grade concussions 1, 2, or 3. And, we just say, even now, some people don't like the terminology mild, moderate, and severe. And so we start to signify the concussions by types. There's various subtypes about what part of the brain they affected, and we like to use that. That's helpful in diagnosis and recovery. And so when these can vary wildly, even if you've had multiple concussions. Your first concussion may not be like your second or third, God forbid that you have more than 1 or 2. But so what we do is we take that information for each individual person, right? And it may matter, it may not, as to what position they play, what kind of scoring that they've done, their educational background. A lot of these factor into how these players recover. And if you're not taking all of that into the totality of the equation, then I think that you're missing points, right? And so it used to be this old school way that you had a concussion, we'd sit you in a dark room with sunglasses and tell you not to do anything, right? We've evolved way, way beyond that. And that's, we're going back 15, 20 years ago now. But what we try to do is we actually see, and the research supports this, we actually see that early activity does help support concussion rehab, as long as it's controlled and you're not exacerbating symptoms. Depending upon the type or the location of the area that's affected in your brain, the rehab is dictated as to which path you follow, right? It's not just cut and dry. There's not just, oh, you hurt your brain, so you do X, Y, and Z. No, there's a definite path now, and I applaud the concussion researchers that have helped us figure this out, whether it's a vestibular concussion, whether it's an ocular concussion, whether you have different exercises that you go through that. And I've been fortunate to learn a lot of these on my own. I'm by no means a concussion rehab expert, but I've done quite a bit of it. And I feel like I've learned a lot from that as to better handle these situations when the time comes, right? And so, now we actually do things like prescribe video games, for instance, to try to get your hand-eye coordination back, to try to get your eyes focusing correctly again. And, again, I think it's the evolution of all of that. Now, I was part of a medical staff that helped formulate a 5-stage step in the NFL where we wouldn't let you pass out of each stage until you were 24 hours symptom free with that activity in that stage. So you do stage 1. Okay, did you do okay with that? Good. Let's wait 24 hours and see if you had any symptoms. Okay, let's do stage 2. Did you do good with that? Okay, let's wait 24 hours, see if you have any symptoms. And we wouldn't graduate you until you did that, right? So in our protocols, those 5 stages were really important. And if you did one stage and you had symptoms, well, then you stayed in that stage till you graduated out of there. And I think that was really another extra layer of protection for the players to be like, look, we're not going to push this. Like, your brain is your brain. We want to help support this. And I think a lot of people think that, just because we work for the team and, things like that, yeah, we want our players back. Who doesn't? But, with brain injuries, there's just that extra layer of like, all right, we're going to just take this how it comes, and we're going to take symptoms day by day, and we'll see what happens. Right. And then ultimately culminating in those steps or those stages. And again, this is free information on the NFL's website, that, you gradually return people back to practice and contact, but you don't do that way up here unless they've done all the work down here in the beginning stages. Right. And I think those beginning stages are even more crucial. We see patterns with those, whether how long it takes you to graduate out of stages. We see, if you struggle in the early stages early on, obviously your recovery is going to be a little bit more prolonged, and that's fine. We don't detriment those people, because getting those early stages right is absolutely crucial in your recovery. You don't want to send somebody back to the 4th or 5th stage of practice and contact if they're still having trouble focusing, or if they get headaches when, they open their eyes, obviously, like, anything really, really basic. So, to your point, and I'm being a very long-winded answer here, I think it's incredibly crucial that the evolution of these rehabilitation for these players has evolved, right? And the people that do this really, really well, and we're talking about not only people that work with athletes, but people with work with more significant concussions from, armed forces or military or, car accidents and things like that, that they're the ones that have been teaching us how to do this right. And so, we've taken those steps and learned from them. And I think it's only helped NFL player safety.
That's awesome. And I'll leave, maybe we can leave on this last one quick, is part of that rehab process, part of that, graduating those early stages and being able to move once you've cleared symptom-free hurdles, I'll call them, right?
Yeah.
Just because a concussion, the onset of a concussion, looks a certain way on TV, and it happens to one player, and then another player has a concussion that doesn't look as bad to the naked eye on TV, that does not mean that their rehab processes are going to be easier for the one and harder for the other. It could actually be reversed, because each person's an individual. Is that true?
Yeah, and it's so incredibly true. And if that's one message that we can get out today about how this goes, is there's some thought process out there, and I'll let people debate and decide this, that if you actually get knocked out harder and unconscious, that protects your brain. I don't know if I prescribe to that specifically. There's some thought process that if you get the little dings and whatever, maybe that's worse. And so there's a lot of thoughts that go back and forth into these injuries, right? But the most important thing is that you realize that just because someone took a hit and they look fine doesn't mean they're fine. And just because someone took a nasty hit doesn't mean that they're affected at all, right? And so there's so much gray area. There's so much context that has to be gleaned from all of these things, because what we see observably on TV is one piece of the puzzle, right? It's literally one piece of the puzzle of a very complex puzzle. And I'm guilty of this too, because, I'm biased, right? I stood on those sidelines for so many years and saw these things. And so I obviously, have feelings one way or the other. That doesn't mean that I'm right. That doesn't mean that everybody out there on TV is right either. And so, there's a lot of things that go into every diagnosis. And while we don't know the results of all the testing that happens on the sideline and inside the locker room, that doesn't mean that what was there isn't real also. So it goes both ways, right? And so, what we like to do is just, especially us now as spectators, you take a little bit of grain of salt with what you see, because not everything is what it appears. But also, you have to understand that there's so many layers of complexity to it that, it's really for the player's safety. And I think that's the biggest take-home message here that we can talk about today with concussion rehabilitation in general. That moving forward, I think it's important understanding to realize that these layers are there for a reason, right? Because we realized that there was a hole in what we used to do and how to go about it. And so, we as healthcare professionals, especially that work with professional athletes, have tried to evolve from that and make sure everybody's doing things the right way.
Yeah, great message. This was incredibly helpful. Audience, if you have any questions, drop them in the comments. We'll get you the right answers. I will certainly be calling Aaron for those answers, but we'll certainly get you those. This has been Aaron Borgmann, former NFL physical therapist and athletic trainer for both the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles. I am Brett Yarris, and this has been PFN Pulse. And unfortunately, concussions are a part of the game, and they will be a continued part of the pulse of pro football.